This video will discuss political participation and voter behavior in American government. People participate in politics in many different ways. Some examples are voting for the president, writing to a congressman, making a presentation to city council or to a school board, or simply calling the police to complain about an annoying neighbor. Because of federalism, people have many opportunities to participate in the government since they can do so on the federal, state, or local level. Now, Americans tend to engage more frequently in non-electoral forms of political participation, like community involvement and contacting public officials. Low voter turnout indicate a great amount of apathy about our political system, and that's terrible because if only a very few amount of people learn about the issues and are actually aware of the issues, then we're very open for takeover and or manipulation by the government. Most Europeans have a 70% voter turnout, whereas most Americans only have a 50% voter turnout. However, it is very important to note that since the 2004 election, things have changed. In 2004, the turnout was 60% for the presidential election, and in 2008 the turnout was 70%. Americans most commonly participate in politics by following and voting for presidential elections. Very few people, only about 30%, actually go out and vote for congressional elections, which are held every 2 years. Many statistics often show that more Americans vote during presidential elections because people are basically liars. People know that they're supposed to vote, so they often tend to lie on these polls, and these statistics are often very skewed. Demographic characteristics associated with high levels of political participation include high education, religious involvement, race and ethnicity, age and gender. The most important characteristic of a politically active citizen is education. The well-educated better understand complex issues, and they understand the importance of voting, and also their jobs allow them to take off time to vote. Religious people are also much more likely to vote because church involvement leads to social connectedness, teaches organizational skills, and increases awareness of societal issues. Racially speaking, whites have the highest tendency to vote, and when regarding age, the highest percentage of voters are 45 and above. Now, despite the big push in the 1970s to pass the 26th Amendment to lower the voting age to 18 from 21, young people still have embarrassingly low voting rates. For many years, women voted a lot less than men, but recently, since the late 1900s, they've began to vote much more, so now both men and women vote about the same amount. It's also important to note a person is affected by many factors like age, social class, education level, race, and gender. Thus, factors form cross-cutting cleavages, making it important to control for other factors that may produce a counter-influence. So, to compare gender differences in voter turnout, you have to compare people of the same age, education, and race. Basically, to compare one factor, the other four factors have to be maintained. Originally, the Constitution let individual states determine the qualification for voting. Although there was small variations from state to state. All states excluded women and blacks and basically required property ownership to some degree. It wasn't until Andrew Jackson's time during the 1830s that universal manhood suffrage was granted, and that allowed for all white males to vote by lifting the property requirements. In 1870, after the Civil War, blacks got the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. Despite the 15th Amendment, many state legislators enacted the Jim Crow laws, which included the grandfather clause, the poll tax, and literacy tests, which made it impossible for blacks to vote. And it really wasn't until the 1960s, with the civil rights movement, that the Jim Crow laws were declared unconstitutional. Like I mentioned earlier, the grandfather clause basically said that you could only vote if your grandfather was a citizen and voted, which automatically excluded all blacks because no one's grandfather at that time could vote. The poll tax was another Jim Crow law, and that's important because it basically people had to pay in order to vote, and blacks during that time were very poor and couldn't vote, and therefore couldn't pay the tax to vote. And lastly, the literacy tests were also a requirement, and that's important because that prevented blacks from voting, because people had to pass a test proving that they could actually read and write, and that was also impossible for many blacks back then because they were enslaved and didn't have the opportunity to an education. Now talking about gender, women really didn't get the right to vote until the 1920s with the passing of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment literally doubled the size of the electorate. In 1971, the 26th Amendment gave 18 to 21-year-olds the right to vote. Increased political activism of young people on college campuses during the 1960s contributed significantly to this expansion of voting. However, the age group of 18 to 21, like I mentioned earlier, still has the lowest voter turnout today. Voter turnouts can be measured by showing the proportion of registered voters that actually voted and by the number of eligible voters. 80% of registered voters vote, whereas only 50% of eligible voters vote. Eligible voters meaning people 18 and above who are American citizens. Only 50% of those vote. America has a notoriously low voter turnout compared to Britain and Canada's, which is 75%, and Australia's, which is 90%. Many people believe that the main problem with the low voter turnout in America is the troublesome process of actually registering to vote. Until a few years ago, some states required voters to register as much as 6 months before the election. So federal law now prohibits any